gavel fell with a crack that sounded less like a verdict and more like a dry twig snapping underfoot. Jedediah Stone didn't flinch. He'd heard louder sounds spook a horse, sounds that meant less. The auctioneer, a portly man with a sweat-stained collar, squinted out at the sparse crowd gathered under the unforgiving glare of the midday sun. "Lot 23, he announced, his voice weary. "A quarter-acre plot bordering the old creek bed. Comes with, well, it comes with a structure." A few chuckles rippled through the onlookers. Everyone knew the cabin on the old Miller place. It was a ruin, a collection of rotting timbers that leaned on each other for support, looking like one stiff breeze would return them to the earth. "Let's start the bidding at $1, the auctioneer said without a lick of hope in his voice. Silence. A horse swished its tail. A fly buzzed past Jed's ear. He stood at the back, a tall, solitary figure, his face a roadmap of hard years and quiet grief. His hat was pulled low, shadowing eyes that had seen too much and said too little since Martha had been taken by the fever 3 years ago. The ranch was quiet now, too quiet. "Come on, folks, the land's no good for grazing, but the wood'll burn," the auctioneer cajoled. 50 cents then, who'll give me 50 cents for the lot?" More silence. Jed had no reason to be here. He had land enough, more than one man could work, but something had pulled him to this auction, a restless energy that wouldn't let him be. When he saw the daguerreotype of the Miller cabin, a strange, unbidden feeling had taken root in his gut, a pull, a whisper. "All right, last chance," the auctioneer sighed, ready to move on. "A quarter, 25 cents for the deed and the trouble of owning it." He meant it as a joke, a final dismissive wave at the worthless plot. But the word hung in the air, and before Jed could reason with himself, before he could question the foolish impulse, his voice, gravelly from disuse, cut through the quiet. 25 cents. The auctioneer's head snapped up. The crowd turned, murmuring. They all knew Jed Stone, knew he was a man of sense, a man who didn't waste a penny or a word. To see him bid on that wreck was a curiosity. "I have a bid of 25 cents from Mr. Stone," the auctioneer said, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. "Going once, going twice." He looked around, but of course no one else spoke. "Sold to Jedediah Stone for the grand sum of 1/4. Jed ignored the stares and the whispers as he strode forward. He dropped a single coin into the auctioneer's palm and took the deed. The paper felt brittle in his calloused hands. He didn't go back to his wagon. He didn't head back to the ranch. He turned his horse and rode straight for the old creek bed, the deed tucked in his coat pocket. An hour later, he stood before it. The cabin was worse up close. The door hung on a single leather hinge, and the roof had a hole big enough to see the sky through. It smelled of rot and abandonment. This was a fool's purchase, he knew it. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling. Something was here. Something was waiting. He put his shoulder to the door. It resisted, wedged tight in its frame. He grunted, pushing harder. With a groan of tortured wood, the door scraped open just enough for him to slip inside. The air was thick, heavy with the dust of forgotten years. Light struggled through the grimy window and the hole in the roof, illuminating swirling dust motes. And then he saw it. In the far corner, a shape, a secret that had been waiting for the door to open. The shape was a huddled mass of rags and fear. As Jed's eyes adjusted to the gloom, the mass resolved into the form of a person, knees drawn up to their chests, head bowed low. He took a slow step forward, his boots scuffing softly on the dirt floor. The figure flinched, a small, sharp intake of breath the only sound in the suffocating silence. "I mean you no harm," Jed said. His voice was rough, but he pitched it low and steady, the way he would to a spooked colt. There was no response. He took another step. He could make out more now. The rags were a dress, torn and filthy. Slender, trembling hands clutched the fabric at the knees. A tangle of dark hair hid the person's face. It was a woman. He stopped a few feet away, giving her space. The cabin was small, barely a room, and his presence seemed to fill it, to shrink the walls around her. He saw the tremor in her shoulders, the instinct to make herself smaller, to disappear into the very shadows that concealed her. "The auctioneer sold me the deed," he explained, keeping his tone even. "I own this place now. Didn't know anyone was living in it." She finally looked up. Her face was smudged with dirt and streaked with tears, but it was her eyes that struck him. They were wide and dark, filled with a terror so profound it felt like a living thing in the small space between them. It was the look of a cornered animal, one that had been running for a very long time. She said nothing, just watched him, every line of her body tensed for flight or a fight she knew she couldn't win. He saw a bruise darkening on her cheekbone, a raw scrape along her jaw. This wasn't just a person down on their luck. This was a person running from violence. Jed's world, which for 3 years had consisted of the ranch, his grief, and the rhythmic cycle of the seasons, was suddenly and irrevocably broken open. He had bought a cabin for 25 cents. What he had found was a secret no one dared to open, a secret of pain and fear huddled in his new derelict property. He stood there, a silent guardian at the broken door, the weight of his unexpected discovery settling on his shoulders. He could see the town from here, could almost hear the sheriff's voice in his head, telling him to turn her in, that she was trouble. But then he looked at her again, at the raw, desperate plea in her eyes, and the thought of the sheriff, of a cell, of questions she was too terrified to answer felt like a betrayal. He had found a secret. Now he had to decide what to do with it. Jed backed away slowly, deliberately, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. He retreated to the doorway, putting the space of the small cabin between them. He needed her to see he wasn't a threat, that the cage she was in wasn't of his making. He unslung the canteen from his shoulder. He uncorked it, the small sound loud in the stillness, and set it on the floor, just inside the cabin. Then he took out a piece of jerky wrapped in wax paper from his saddlebag. He placed it beside the canteen. "Water," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Food. Take it." She watched his every move, her eyes tracking the canteen as if it might be a snake. Her lips were cracked, her breathing shallow. She didn't move. The fear was a wall between them, thick and high. Jed understood walls. He'd built his own around his heart after Martha died. Walls of silence, of routine, of lonely work from sunup to sundown. He recognized the masonry of pain. He backed out of the cabin completely, letting the sunlight flood the doorway. He turned his back to her, a calculated risk, a sign of trust he didn't know if he felt, but one he knew he had to show. He busied himself checking the rotted timber of the porch, making it seem as if she were the last thing on his mind. He waited. Minutes stretched into an eternity. He heard a faint scuffling sound from inside, the scrape of the canteen on the dirt floor. A moment later, the sound of someone drinking, desperate and deep. He didn't turn around. He gave her the dignity of his silence, of his feigned indifference. He heard the crinkle of the wax paper. When he finally glanced over his shoulder, the canteen and the jerky were gone. She was back in the corner, huddled as before, but the desperate cutting edge of her fear had softened just a fraction. It was replaced by a wary exhaustion. She had met a small kindness, and it had confused her terror. He knew he couldn't leave her here. The cabin wouldn't stand up to a strong wind, let alone offer protection from whatever she was running from. He also knew he couldn't force her to come with him. He was a stranger, a big man with calloused hands and a weathered face who had appeared out of nowhere. He walked to his horse and began to uncinch the saddle. He worked with a slow, deliberate rhythm, his movements economical and calm. He was settling in. He wasn't going anywhere. He was showing her, through action rather than words, that he was patient, that the threat, for now, was over, that he wasn't the monster she was expecting. Night would fall soon, and with the darkness, the things that hunted in the night would come. He had a feeling the ones she feared walked on 2 legs. As the sun bled out across the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows from the mesquite trees, Jed built a small fire a good 20 yards from the cabin. He didn't want the smoke to bother her, but he needed the light and the thin veil of security it provided. He cooked a little bacon and brewed coffee in a tin pot, the familiar rituals a comfort in the unsettling quiet. The aroma drifted towards the cabin. He knew she could smell it. He ate his share and left the rest in the skillet by the fire. He sat with his back against a rock, watching the stars begin to prick the deep purple of the sky. He thought of Martha. What would she have done? The answer was immediate and clear. Martha would have already had the woman out of that hovel, wrapped in a blanket with a cup of hot broth in her hands. Martha's compassion had been as vast and unconditional as the plains themselves. His own was a rusty, creaking thing, buried under 3 years of solitude. He had 2 choices. He could ride to town in the morning, fetch Sheriff Miller, and let the law handle it. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. It would absolve him of all responsibility. The woman would be taken in, questioned, and whatever trouble she was in would become the town's problem, not his. Or he could make it his problem. He looked over at the dark, silent cabin. To bring her to his ranch, to the home he'd shared with his wife, felt like a violation of that sacred, lonely space. It meant inviting the world back in, with all its chaos and danger. The very thing he had sought to escape. The trouble that had put that look in her eyes would not be far behind her. It would come looking. It would come to his door. Thought of the look on her face, the raw terror, the bruise. He remembered the vow he'd made at Martha's graveside, a quiet promise to the earth that he would live a life of honor, a life she would have been proud of. Honor wasn't about being sensible. It wasn't about being safe. It was about standing for something when it was hard. He got to his feet, his decision made. It settled in his bones not as a choice but as a duty. He walked to the cabin door, a silhouette against the flickering firelight. "Ma'am," he said, his voice soft but firm, "you can't stay here. This place ain't safe. My ranch is a few miles north. There's a solid roof, a warm bed. You'll be safe there." He waited. For a long moment there was only silence. Then a rustle from within. A shadowy form appeared in the doorway, still hesitant, still afraid, but she had come to the edge of her hiding place. "No one will hurt you," he added, and it felt less like a promise and more like a solemn oath. "I won't let them." She took a tentative step out of the darkness and into the firelight. He saw her clearly for the first time. She was younger than he'd thought, and beneath the dirt and fear there was a strength in the line of her jaw. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He had made his choice, a decision that would bring danger to his door. As he closes that door, we hope you're enjoying this story of courage. If you are, taking a moment to like the video helps us bring more tales like this to you. Now, with the latch thrown, the real challenge began as he helped her onto his horse. The fragile weight of her a stark reminder of the responsibility he had just claimed as his own. The ride to the ranch was silent. Jed sat the saddle and the woman rode behind him, her hands clutching hesitantly at the back of his coat. He could feel the tremors that ran through her body, a constant low-grade vibration of exhaustion and fear. He kept the horse to a steady, unhurried walk, trying to make the journey as smooth as possible. They arrived under a blanket of stars. The ranch house was dark, a long, low silhouette against the hills. To Jed, it was a fortress of solitude. To the woman, he hoped it looked like a sanctuary. He dismounted and helped her down, his hands firm on her waist. She was lighter than a feather, all sharp angles and trembling muscle. She stumbled as her feet hit the ground, and he steadied her, his grip on her arm lingering a moment longer than necessary. "This is it," he said quietly, gesturing to the house. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and old memories. He lit a lantern, and the warm glow pushed back the shadows, revealing a space that was meticulously clean but starkly empty. There were no feminine touches, no curtains on the windows, no rug on the floor. Everything was functional, practical, and lonely. The only softness was in a worn armchair by the cold hearth, the place where Martha used to sit and mend his shirts. He saw the woman's eyes scan the room, taking in its emptiness. He wondered what she saw, a bachelor's home or a widower's shrine. "The guest room is this way," he said, breaking the silence. "The bed is made up, there's a pump in the kitchen for water, the privy is out back." He led her to a small room at the end of the hall. It contained a simple iron-frame bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a small wooden chest. It was the room Martha's sister used to stay in when she visited. It hadn't been used in years. "There's some clothes in the chest," he said, his voice suddenly thick. They were my wife's. They'll be too big for you, but they're clean." He placed the lantern on the washstand and backed out of the room, pulling the door partially closed. He didn't want to trap her, but he wanted to give her the illusion of privacy. He went to the kitchen and stoked the embers in the stove, adding fresh wood until a small fire was crackling. He put a pot of water on to heat. He could hear her moving in the room, the soft footsteps, the creak of the chest's lid. He tried not to imagine Martha's clothes on this stranger, this frightened wisp of a woman he'd brought into his home, but the image came anyway, a painful juxtaposition of the past and the present. By bringing her here, he hadn't just invited in her danger, he had invited in life itself, and it was a painful, complicated, and utterly foreign presence in the quiet halls of his group. For 2 days they lived as ghosts in the same house. The woman, he still didn't know her name, kept to her room mostly. Jed would leave a tray of food by her door and find it empty hours later. He went about his chores, the familiar rhythm of comfort. He mended a fence line, reshod his horse, cleared brush from the creek bed, but the awareness of her presence was a constant hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. The house was no longer just his. On the 3rd morning, he came in from the barn to find her in the kitchen. She was wearing one of Martha's old dresses, a simple calico thing that hung on her small frame. Her hair was washed and tied back, and the cuts on her face were beginning to heal. She was scrubbing the countertop with a determination that was almost fierce, as if she could wash away her past with enough soap and elbow grease. She froze when she saw him, her hands stilling in the wash basin. I wanted to help," she whispered, her voice fragile, like a dried leaf. "It's all right," Jed said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He leaned against the far wall, trying to seem non-threatening. "You don't have to earn your keep." "I need to," she replied, her gaze fixed on the water. "I can't just be a burden." They fell into a companionable silence. She finished scrubbing and began to knead a lump of dough he'd left to rise. Her movements were sure, practiced. She knew her way around a kitchen. "My name is Ilara," she said suddenly, her back still to him. Jed nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Jedediah Stone. Most folks call me Jed." That evening, as they sat at the small kitchen table, eating the fresh bread she had baked, she finally told him her story. The words came out in a torrent at first, then slowed to a trickle as the pain of remembering surfaced. She was from a town 100 miles east. Her father, a merchant deep in debt, had arranged her marriage to a man named Silas Blackwood. Jed's hand tightened around his coffee cup. He knew the name. Blackwood was a land baron, a man with a reputation for cruelty and a bottomless hunger for power. He bought what he could and took what he couldn't. He didn't want a wife, Ilara said, her voice trembling. He wanted a possession, something to show off. The way he looked at me, she trailed off, shuddering. I saw him strike a stable hand for being too slow with his horse. He broke the man's arm and just laughed. She had run away on the morning of her wedding. She'd stolen a horse and ridden until it went lame. Then she'd run on foot, sleeping in ditches, surviving on what she could find. The abandoned cabin had seemed like a miracle, a place to hide until she could figure out what to do next. That was where he had found her. "He'll be looking for me," she finished, her eyes dark with a fear that was now shared. "He doesn't like to be defied. He sees me as his property, and he'll hunt me down to prove a point." Jed looked at her, this small, brave woman who had chosen a desperate flight over a gilded cage. His resolve, which had been forged in a moment of instinct, now hardened into tempered steel. This was no longer just about helping a stranger. This was about standing against a man like Silas Blackwood. It was about honor, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that his quiet life was over. In the days that followed, a subtle shift occurred in the lonely ranch house. It began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a home. Ilara, having unburdened herself of her secret, seemed to shed a layer of her fear. She was still quiet, still cautious, but a light had returned to her eyes. She filled the house with the scent of baking bread and the quiet hum of activity. She mended Jed's shirts with neat tiny stitches and planted a small herb garden in a patch of earth by the kitchen door. Jed found himself watching her. He watched the way she cared for the new plants, the gentle way she spoke to his horse, the focus in her eyes as she worked. She had a resilience that astounded him. She was not a broken thing. She was a sapling that had been bent by a storm but refused to snap. They fell into a rhythm. He would work the ranch during the day, and she would manage the house. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, often in silence, watching the stars. But it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't empty. It was filled with a shared understanding, a burgeoning trust. One evening, he found himself telling her about Martha. He spoke of her laughter, her kindness, the way she could make even the harshest winter feel warm. It was the first time he'd spoken of her to anyone in 3 years. Telling Ilara didn't feel like a betrayal of Martha's memory. It felt like an honoring of it. He was sharing the best part of his past with the fragile hope of his future. Ilara listened, her expression full of a deep, sorrowful empathy. "She sounds like she was a wonderful woman," she said softly. "She was," Jed confirmed, his voice thick. He realized he was no longer just protecting Elara out of a sense of duty. He was protecting her because the thought of Silas Blackwood laying his cruel hands on her sent a hot spike of anger through him. He was protecting the light she had brought back into his dark, quiet world. The bond between them wasn't one of passion, not yet. It was something quieter, deeper. It was a bond forged in shared grief and mutual respect, a delicate thing taking root in the fertile ground of the sanctuary he had offered. But they both knew the sanctuary was temporary. The threat of Blackwood was a shadow on the horizon, a storm gathering its strength, waiting for the right moment to break over their fragile peace. The peace was shattered a week later. Jed needed supplies, flour, salt, coffee, and he could no longer put off the ride into the town of redemption. He told Elara to keep the doors bolted and to stay out of sight. He didn't like leaving her, the protective instinct in him roaring at the thought, but it was necessary. Buildings was a dusty collection of buildings huddled along a single main street. As Jed tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store, he felt a change in the town's atmosphere. It was tense, coiled. Men spoke in low voices, their eyes darting about nervously. He saw the reason soon enough. Standing on the boardwalk outside the saloon were three men who didn't belong. They were dressed in expensive, tailored coats, their gun belts new and gleaming. They carried themselves with the lazy arrogance of men who were paid to be dangerous. And with them, talking to Sheriff Miller, was a man whose face was a mask of cold fury. He was handsome in a cruel sort of way, with piercing eyes and a snare that seemed permanently etched onto his lip. He held a small, silver-framed daguerreotype in his hand. Jed didn't need to see the picture. He knew it was Silas Blackwood. He kept his head down, pulling the brim of his hat lower. He entered the general store, his senses on high alert. He could hear their voices through the open door. "She's a slight thing, dark hair, looks more fragile than she is," Blackwood was saying, his voice a silken threat. "My fiancée had a moment of fright before our wedding. I'm just here to bring her home." Sheriff Miller, a man whose spine was made more of jelly than of steel, nodded obsequiously. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood, we'll keep an eye out. There aren't many places to hide out here. If she's in this county, we'll find her." Jed gathered his supplies, his movements stiff. His jaw was clenched so tight it ached. Blackwood was here. The snake was in the garden. The external threat was no longer a distant possibility. It was in his town, breathing his air, poisoning the well of his fragile peace. He paid the storekeeper, his eyes avoiding the scene outside. He loaded the flour and coffee into his saddlebags, his mind racing. How long would it take Blackwood to start checking the outlying ranches? How long until his inquiries led him to the man who'd bought a worthless cabin for a quarter? The danger was no longer on the horizon. It was at his gate, and it would be coming for Elara. Jed rode back to the ranch with a storm in his heart, pushing his horse harder than he normally would. The miles seemed to stretch on forever. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper of Blackwood's name. He found Elara in the yard, scattering feed for the chickens. She looked up as he approached, a smile gracing her lips before it vanished, replaced by a look of concern as she saw the grim set of his jaw. "What is it?" she asked, her hands twisting in her apron. "He's here," Jed said, swinging down from the saddle. "Blackwood. He's in town with hired guns, asking questions." The color drained from her face. The old familiar terror returned to her eyes, extinguishing the light he had come to cherish. "He found me." "Peter hasn't found you," Jed corrected her, his voice firm, willing his own resolve into her. "He's found the town. He doesn't know about this place. Not yet, but he will." Fear made her want to run, he could see. Her gaze darted towards the open plains, the instinct for flight a powerful primal urge. But she held her ground. She looked at Jed, at the steadfast certainty in his eyes, and her fear was met by his strength. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice a bare whisper. The word "we" hung in the air between them. It was a turning point. This was no longer just his fight to protect her. It was their fight to survive. "We prepare," he said. The sanctuary was about to become a fortress. That afternoon, the tenor of their life on the ranch changed. Jed no longer mended fences, he reinforced them. He brought the spare horses into the corral near the house. He took down the heavy Winchester rifle from over the mantel, cleaning and oiling it with a grim efficiency. He checked the ammunition he had, counting the cartridges, his movements precise and deliberate. His lips moved slowly and deliberate. Ilara worked alongside him. She didn't cower in her room. She filled every available cask and bucket with water from the well. She boarded up the small window at the back of the house, her hammer blows echoing his own. There was a fire in her now, a spark of defiance ignited by Jed's unwavering courage. She would not be a helpless victim waiting for rescue. She would be a partner in her own defense. That night the house was dark. No lanterns were lit. They sat in the main room, the Winchester leaning against Jed's chair, a second smaller pistol on the table before Ilara. The quiet was different now. It was no longer peaceful. It was the heavy, pregnant silence before a thunderstorm, thick with tension and the metallic taste of impending violence. Their bond, forged in the quiet moments, was now to be tested in the crucible of conflict. They didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, in the hazy heat of the late afternoon, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. It was too large for a single rider. Jed watched it from the porch, his hand resting on the stock of the Winchester. He'd known this was coming. He'd prepared for it. But the sight of it still turned the blood in his veins to ice. Ilara came to stand beside him, her face pale but her eyes resolute. She held the small pistol in her hand, her knuckles white. "Go inside," he said, not taking his eyes off the approaching riders. "Bar the door. Stay away from the windows." "No," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "I'm not hiding anymore. I'm standing with you." He looked at her then and saw not the frightened woman from the cabin, but a partner, a soldier in their small army of two. He gave a single, curt nod. 4 riders emerged from the dust cloud. Silas Blackwood was in the lead, flanked by his 3 hired guns. They reined in their horses just beyond the fence line, 100 yards from the house. They sat there for a long moment, sizing up the small ranch, the solitary figure on the porch. "Stone!" Blackwood's voice cut through the air, sharp and arrogant. "Jedediah Stone. I know she's in there. I have a legal writ for the return of my betrothed. Send her out now and I'll overlook the fact that you've been harboring a runaway." Jeb didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a silent, immovable object of defiance. His silence was a better answer than any words of denial. Blackwood's handsome face twisted into a sneer. "Don't be a fool, rancher. This has nothing to do with you. She is my property. I've come to collect what is mine. Give her to me or we will burn this pathetic hovel to the ground with you in it." The threat hung in the hot, still air. This was the moment of truth, the final confrontation. Jed had offered sanctuary. Now he had to make the stand to defend it. He slowly raised the Winchester, the click of the hammer being pulled back unnaturally loud in the silence. "This is my home," Jed's voice rang out, steady and clear, carrying across the dusty yard. "And the lady is under my protection. You are not welcome here. Turn around and ride away." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "So be it." He nodded to his men. "Tear it down." The final confrontation had begun. The firefight erupted with a deafening roar. One of Blackwood's men spurred his horse forward, firing his pistol wildly at the house. Jed was already moving. He dropped to one knee behind the thick porch railing, brought the Winchester to his shoulder, and fired. The shot was clean, deliberate. The rider cried out and tumbled from his saddle. Chaos descended. The other 2 gunmen dismounted, using their horses for cover as they returned fire. Splinters flew from the porch posts. A bullet shattered the window of the main room, showering the floor with glass. Jed stayed low, using the knowledge of his own home as a weapon. He knew every angle, every piece of solid cover. He fired again, forcing one of the men to duck back behind his horse. He was outnumbered, but he was on his own ground. "Jed," Ilara's voice called from the doorway. "The side window." He glanced back. She was pointing towards the side of the house. One of the gunmen was trying to sneak around to get a clear shot at him from the flank. Jed fired at the man's last known position, keeping him pinned down. "I need you to reload the spare rifle," he yelled, never taking his eyes off the fight. Ilara disappeared inside. A moment later, she was back, pushing the second rifle through the doorway. Her hands were steady, her face was grim. She was no longer a liability. She was a lifeline. Jed fought with a cold, focused fury. He wasn't just fighting for Ilara anymore. He was fighting for the life she represented, for the chance to feel something again besides grief. He was fighting for his home, not just the wood and nails, but the possibility of what it could be, a place of warmth and laughter once more. He caught a glimpse of movement and fired. The second gunman went down with a cry. Now it was 2 against 2. But Blackwood wasn't a fighter. He was a coward who paid others to do his dirty work. He stayed back, using his last man as a shield. The final gunman made a mistake. He grew impatient and broke cover, trying to rush the porch. Jed's Winchester barked once more. The man fell into the dust and lay still. Silence descended, thick and sudden. It was broken only by the panting of the horses and the ringing in Jed's ears. It was over. All that was left was the snake himself. Silas Blackwood stood alone in the dusty yard, his hired protection gone. The sneer was gone from his face, replaced by a look of disbelief and fury. He drew his own pistol, a fancy silver-inlaid weapon that had likely never been fired in anger. "This isn't over, Stone," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "She's mine." Jed rose slowly from behind the railing, the Winchester held loosely at his side. He stepped off the porch and walked into the yard, stopping 20 paces from Blackwood. This was between them now, a test of will. "She is a free woman," Jed said, his voice low and dangerous. "She's not a piece of property. You have no claim here." "I've a claim of honor," Blackwood spat. "She shamed me." "You don't know the first thing about honor," Jed replied, his gaze like flint. "Honor is about protecting the innocent, not preying on them. You have a choice. Get on your horse and ride out of this valley, never come back." Blackwood's face was a mask of rage. His vanity, his pride, his sense of ownership, it was all he had. To be defied by a simple rancher and the woman who had spurned him was more than he could bear. He raised his pistol. He was fast, but his rage made him clumsy. Jed was faster. He had lived with a rifle in his hands. It was an extension of his will. The Winchester came up, fired once, and the silver pistol flew from Blackwood's hand as the bullet shattered his wrist. Blackwood screamed, clutching his ruined hand, his face pale with shock and pain. Jed walked forward, his expression unreadable. He stood over the whimpering man, a silent, grim-faced judge. He could end it right here. One more bullet and the threat of Silas Blackwood would be gone from the world forever. The thought was tempting. But he looked back at the porch and saw Ilara standing there, her eyes wide. He saw the future in them, a future of peace, not of bloodshed. Killing a man in a firefight was one thing. Executing a disarmed man, no matter how vile, was another. It was a line he would not cross. "Get up," Jed said, his voice flat. He took the reins of Blackwood's horse and led it over. "Get on, and if I ever see your face in this county again, I will not be so merciful." Blackwood, cradling his broken hand, stumbled to his horse and clumsily pulled himself into the saddle. He gave Jed one last look of pure hatred before spurring the horse into a gallop, disappearing in a cloud of dust, a defeated coward, running from the consequences of his own cruelty. Jed stood in the yard for a long moment, the rifle still in his hand, until the dust settled. The silence that returned was not empty, it was earned. It was the silence of victory, of peace. He turned and walked back to the porch. Ilara met him at the steps. She didn't speak. She simply stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in his chest. He stood stiffly for a second, surprised by the contact, before his own arms came up to encircle her, holding her tight. The lonely ranch was a home for two. In the quiet aftermath, as the sun began to set, they stood together, two solitary souls who had found in each other not just a sanctuary, but a future. Months later, the scars on the porch posts had been smoothed over and new glass was in the window. The herb garden Ilara had planted was thriving, and the scent of rosemary and thyme now mingled with the familiar smell of wood smoke. Laughter, a sound long absent, was now a frequent guest in the ranch house. Jedediah Stone was still a quiet man, but the deep lines of grief on his face had softened. He had bought a ruined cabin for $25, and in it he had found the secret to rebuilding his life. He had found Ilara. You've just witnessed a story of quiet strength and redemption. If this tale resonated with you, subscribe to our channel for more stories from the American West. Let us know your favorite moment in the comments below. Thank you for watching.